project is on the regional airlines across the country. And first off, to give you a little background, regional airlines have been around as long as any other type of airline, and more recently they've become a larger part of the industry in the U.S. To better suit specific market needs and satisfy the needs financially for the major carriers. And some people do exhibit fear of these airlines, and this is without specifically knowing how to identify these types of airlines or have a full understanding of how safe aviation in this country actually is. And to tell you a little bit about myself, last summer I did work for the FAA at an air traffic control tower in Bedford, Mass. At Hanscom Field, and that gave me a good sense of knowing the airlines and knowing airport operations, seeing it from the regulatory level, and that has helped me to have a better stance on being able to inform you about the things you may not know about airline operations around the country. And my mission here on this project has been to show that the attention from the media and other sources has led to misunderstandings about airline safety. And most people do learn about these airlines through media reports and not much else. And more previously, questions have arisen about the integrity of these types of airlines and whether people should or should not feel safe. And I'm looking to answer the specific question: in what unintentional ways are regional airlines being portrayed to appear less safe than the situation is in reality today. And getting the inside story on aviation, I wanted to have the opportunity through this fourth term field work to pursue working hands-on with an airline to show what safety culture is like and how it's largely ignored by the people. This goes into every aspect of airport operations and what airlines put together and their procedures in terms of handling the aircraft at the airport. Every priority is around safety and nothing else. It's not about being on time, on budget. It's always safety, and that's what builds the entire operations, whether it be in the airport, on the flight deck, or any aspect of these airlines at all. And I set out to have employment arranged at 3 different airlines. These were AirTran Airways, JetBlue Airways, and Midwest Airlines. And unfortunately, after I had gone to them, none were able to find a position available for me in this time frame for senior year project. But I've also had an ongoing attempt to work at Hanscom Field, where I worked last summer, this time with the Massachusetts Port Authority, which is a regulatory body which does oversee some airports. And that is still yet to be determined, but unfortunately I've had nothing at airports and involved with airlines during this time to share with you today. And that's part of the whole experience of doing primary research. You have some intentions, you set out to do the right thing, but it always doesn't work out, and it's good to have secondhand options to be able to get whatever types of firsthand experience to bring to the table today. And just to show you more where regional airlines fit in and what they do for the consumer, there's a distinctive difference between regional carriers and major carriers, which is not always clear-cut and easy to see. On the left, we have a major airline, U.S. Airways, operating their own aircraft with their own crews and their own network that they've had for years. But also they brand out to express carriers. This one's called Republic Airways on the right, and they look very similar to most people, but because it is the U.S. Airways Express brand, that writes off the entire, well, not the entire, but most aspects of the operation when it comes to the crews and the management and the actual aircraft. They're under the operating certificate of a completely different carrier. And even though people do fly these airlines, booking a ticket on U.S. Airways, they're not always going to be flying on that major carrier, and they may be trusted to fly on a regional airline which can deliver to the markets that may have less seats wanted for each route or have more departures per day to better suit the consumer's needs. And where they fit into the industry today, most people don't know that regional airlines account for more than half of domestic flights today in the U.S., and part of their operation is actually going to smaller airports which don't have any other airline service, and the government steps in and financially compensates some of these airlines to fly to specific airports, which without airline service, their local economies may suffer. So it is vital for them to play a part in getting people to destinations that are not always accessible by air. And the role in seamless air travel, being able to have a major airline deliver the same brand expectations and brand loyalty to customers through a trusted regional airline. They're trusted to deliver the same services with less seats and lower costs overall, so that the airline is able to reach many markets all around the world without necessarily having their crews and their aircraft flying to those destinations, but still being able to offer that service. And it's a very effective market strategy for reaching airports with, as I said, low demand and offering more flights per day on regional routes so that the consumer can get to where they want to go at a price they want to pay. And some customers do prefer regional airline service. The regional aircraft take up less space at the airport, less gate space, and it's a quicker experience getting on and off the aircraft, so you can actually get to where you want to go a little faster if you are flying on these regional aircraft. And a lot of people still, despite this, only see the negative aspects that might be centered around one or two regional airlines, and they connect it to all airlines in this type of service. And last year, there was a fatal crash in Buffalo, New York. This was a Continental Connection flight, and it's the same type of plane you see here in this picture. And it was actually operated by one of these regional airlines called Colgan Air, even though they were flying for the Continental Airlines brand and delivering that expected service. And it was the first accident that was fatal in 2.5 years in the US, which means that about 6 billion people were transported across the country without any loss of life, which is very remarkable. But despite that, there were a lot of alarming reports coming out in the wake of this tragedy. Just one example was a 60-minute special on PBS Frontline entitled Flying Cheap, and that centered around the issues of pilot qualifications and daily fatigue and having long work hours to explain how the Colgan Air crash was caused. And even though they only looked at this one specific airline, they wanted to connect it to all types of regional airlines and make people question the industry, whether it is as safe as people have previously trusted it to be. And they painted the whole industry with a very broad brush rather than looking at this one specific company and what they may have done wrong. And several statistics and facts on this program were slightly skewed and didn't tell the entire story. One example was the narrator, Miles O'Brien, said that since 2002, the last 6 fatal airline accidents in this country have all involved regionals. If you look at the National Transportation Safety Board, who investigates airline incidents, they have published reports that says in 2005, there was an incident in Southwest Airlines in Chicago in which somebody was struck by a plane that had overshot the runway and actually burst through the airport fence, and somebody in a car actually died in that accident, and that was not counted in this statistic. So you cannot say that everything is fairly straightforward in this type of reporting. And if you don't know, Southwest Airlines is a major airline and not a regional airline. So with that, I have found some conflicting information on what has been reported, and also additionally, in terms of inspectors at the Federal Aviation Administration meant to ensure safety at airlines. O'Brien was talking about the number of inspectors, which was about 2,000, meant to inspect over 25,000 flights per day that operate. But really, they're not inspecting the actual flights. They're inspecting the planes that operate the flights. And many airlines operate their planes as many as 5, 6, 7, or more times per day. And this is more at regional airlines. So they should have been counting the number of aircraft to be inspected rather than the number of flights. And just to tell you a little more about the crash that happened in Buffalo last year, the captain in the left seat, his name was Marvin Renslow, and he only had about 800 hours of flight experience. And when they were coming on their descent into Buffalo, this was February, so it was a very cold night. And what actually had started to happen was ice was building up on the wings of the aircraft as it was slowing down to its approach speed. And that was limiting the effect of the lift produced by the wings. And as this plane slowed down and they put the gear and the flaps down, the plane started to slow down to a dangerously slow speed. And reacting to this, the captain pulled back on the controls to try to level the plane out at a constant altitude rather than pushing forward and trying to sink down and regain airspeed. And because they were at such a low approach altitude, this pulling back on the controls, which ended up being the wrong move, ended up slowing the plane even further, and it did eventually lose control, and 50 people perished in that accident. But we have learned several lessons from what happened today, and how many people need to be more focused on how we train the pilots and what our expectations are for them in terms of professionalism and decision making. And the next question comes, who regulates these airlines? On the left you have the Federal Aviation Administration, often referred to as the FAA. It's part of the U.S. Department of Transportation. Their job is to certify pilots, airports, and airlines. They operate our air traffic control system, and they support new innovations that improve the system and things that come out. And then there's the National Transportation Safety Board, an agency that investigates crashes in all aspects of travel, including aviation, and they make recommendations to new changes in policy, among other regulatory bodies. And actually, the past 3 days, there have been hearings about professionalism in aviation, both at airlines and air traffic control, that the NTSB has been compiling information from all these different sources to discuss new ways for insurance that people working in this industry do act more professionally to avoid future tragedies. And things you may not know about these types of regional airlines, about 4 out of 5 regional aircraft today are jets. And these regional jets are some of the most advanced planes in the sky, and the others, the turboprops, actually use less fuel, so they're a more environmentally conscious choice by the airlines to deliver their service. And regional aircraft, because of the time they became popular in the late 90s and early in this past decade, they actually are newer and more advanced than most of the planes that are becoming obsolete that the major airlines do operate. So they're more up to date technologically, they're more adaptable in certain parts of the industry, and they deliver on the customer's needs in an effective way. And I also surveyed Newton North students about where they stand on the issue. I showed them a picture of a regional jet as I was describing, and I asked whether they would feel safe or not flying on this type of plane. And 81% responded that they would feel safe out of the first 100 that responded, and the remaining 19% said they would feel unsafe flying on this type of aircraft. So that was a very alarming number, considering hundreds of thousands of people fly in these types of planes every day, and that this fear they may exhibit may be unnecessary. So that was driving some of what I was doing as I was going forward in this project. And I wanted to consult the experts on these issues. I know and was able to connect with people in aviation and the media for insight. And one of the first people I went to was Barbara Patzner. She's the airport manager of Hanscom Field, where I'm trying to work with Massport. And she was able to sit down and provide comment, and she said the following about that survey that I had given. My guess, and it's strictly a guess, is that they are claustrophobic. Small airplanes make you feel a little cramped, and therefore it gives them an anxiety feeling. And I did videotape and record this interview, and unfortunately, because of public relations regulations, she was not actually able to provide official comment, which could be provided on the internet. So she had actually contacted me to get rid of the video that I had put up for everybody evaluating this project to see. But I have transcribed it and written up the whole thing, which can be seen on my Wikispaces website, and she had a lot of interesting things to say. And another person I went to was Doug Abbey. He is an aviation consultant, and he said when it comes to pilot hours and duty days, this is the marketplace of work, and that's the reality for a first officer coming out of flight school to be making $21 an hour and working several days, more than 8 hours at a time. That's what the market demands. If people want a low price and they want to be flying on aircraft that have frequent flights, you're going to have these situations on the low end of the spectrum when people first entering the industry are in difficult places for a living and have to work their way up through their careers in order to get to a more comfortable living situation. And this is because of the market expectations for the airline industry today. And this is all across the board, not at any specific carrier. And this man is nationally syndicated as a columnist for many different aspects of contributing in airline and aviation, and he was a very good source to go to. And also, when speaking about safety, he noted, quote, "Obviously nobody wants to have an accident, not the feds, not the airlines, or the passengers. Nobody wants that to happen. That's always been their highest priority, but it has been a slight challenging time for them, despite these market needs for them to perform." And another person I went to was a longtime friend of mine. He's an airline vice president at Midwest Airlines. His name is Craig Aratakis. He's the vice president of planning at that airline, and he was able to give some insight. He said, "When we took Midwest Airlines to a mostly regional airline operation, we set ourselves up for some pretty big criticism. And one of his latest projects is he's taking this airline, Midwest Airlines, on the right and merging it with Frontier Airlines, which is a very big airline in the western part of the country you may not have heard of. But right now they're merging those two carriers together, and part of the new ownership at Midwest Airlines is adapting it under a larger umbrella of a historically regional airline, and they gave up their Boeing aircraft and some of their flight crews in order to fly these types of planes. And he knew that in making this move, he might be criticized for that action because of the more recent assumptions about regional airlines that are out there. But he's been very happy with the results thus far, and now they're a very large airline with modern Airbus aircraft alongside these brand new regional jets which they're flying, and he's very happy with where the airline is headed. And he actually did also survey some customers about the new experience on board with the new aircraft they had, and survey results thus far is that people are saying they're very happy with the new experience they're offering. So that's very good signs. And then also, to cover journalism, I got a professor's view. This man is Chris Daly. He's a professor at Boston University and was able to explain the roles and responsibilities of journalists today. He's worked as a reporter for more than 20 years, and he is also a blogger about the topic of journalism, in addition to his ongoing work at BU. And he said that most people don't pay attention to most types of news. They pay selective attention to the things they care about, whether it be politics, sports, weather, but they're not always looking for a breaking story to kind of present their new opinions about the way they live their life and make decisions. And then another person I went to, looking for where the media comes in. I know that people do get some information from the media on breaking stories that may influence their decisions, but not necessarily. So I wanted to cover the aspects of creating a story when it comes to breaking news to ensure that all the facts come through and that it's not something that may have been based on speculation or not necessarily untrue. So this was Steve Cooper. He works at WHDH, the NBC Channel 7 in Boston, and he stressed that we have a procedure in place that includes checks and balances to make sure we are fair. And also, you never want to make any assumptions or speculate about what happened, just report the facts. So it was very good to hear from him that when it comes to creating a story that you may only have 30 minutes or an hour to put together, that they have a whole procedure to ensure that everything comes through with a lot of integrity and isn't based on any skepticism or criticisms. And what has developed since I started this project, the U.S. Congress has changed its policy requiring regional airlines to have pilots hired with 800 hours of previous flight experience, and this is up from 250 hours of flight time, so it's more than triple that previous number. One reason the number had been 250 previously was because of the number of pilot spots that captains coming out of their training were competing for. There were a lot of spots out there to fill, and therefore they had to have certain standards in order to meet the demands to get those positions filled. But more recently, because of economic times, there aren't as many emerging pilot and first officer positions to be filled, so the airlines can have a higher standard in the numbers for each airline captain looking to start their profession, because those spots are limited and there's more competition for each space. And I've been able to uncover things that people hear are not always completely true, and there may be a second side to the story. and having this time gave me an opportunity to look into certain reports and see where things had integrity and where things were not necessarily true and the whole truth was not presented. And all in all, this is an extremely safe industry of commercial aviation, and it never stops becoming safer and improving, and travelers really have little to worry about, considering based on statistics going way back that if you're flying on a plane, it's more dangerous riding in a car to the airport than actually flying on the plane. So that should be very relieving news, and that's always been the case, and that spread between safety on the roads versus safety in the sky, it keeps spreading in the airline's favor, that it's a very safe industry, and we've seen that over a very long period of time. And when isolated incidents do come out and people publicize these types of reports, that sometimes does spark a stigma of unnecessary fear associated with these isolated events and how tragic it can be, in comparing it to stuff they may have seen on movies or TV shows where it's kind of a overemphasized thing that a plane may crash, and that's always a lingering thing, when really it's something that happens very, very rarely, and people really shouldn't have it on their minds really at all. And I myself have learned tremendously through this experience. I've taken away a great deal of knowledge through the unique opportunity to go through primary research at a college level, and I've been able to tap the resources of the greater community to connect back to something I can talk about here at Newton North High School while not having the ability to fully go as in depth when staying inside of this building. And a few things through the Newton North community have compared to this type of independent spirit needed to be successful in this project. I needed to be very independent. I needed to find people in the real world who were able to contribute and may not have been able to if I was just in here on a day-to-day basis, and that has really helped tremendously. And because we do have a little bit of extra time, I just want to show you a couple of clips to contrast the regional airline, the role of a regional airline in the US versus in places like Europe and the Caribbean, where they're relied on to reach very isolated resort destinations and put lives on the line. And really the conclusion here is that pilots in other parts of the country, especially at these regional airlines with smaller planes, have to work much harder for their money than they do in places such as here. And this is a DVD documentary about a European-based airline that flies the Dash 8-300, which is a smaller version of the plane that crashed in Buffalo. And this is in Elba. It's an island in Italy, and you're about to see them make a very dangerous approach, which is a routine thing that they're expected to do. So watch and enjoy. Very, very small, short runway. So they do luckily here stop in time, and if you think that's not hair-raising enough, they actually also were able to catch a clip of the same airline from the outside, which also just conveys how daring this whole encounter is. So that's them diving over the mountain right there as they go into this tiny little airport here. Okay, so a special thanks to Just Planes Videos who produced that documentary about this European airline, and it really is a good demonstration to show how regional airlines in other parts of the world do fly into small airstrips that have very little regulation in terms of safety compared to here in the United States, where regional airlines fly modern aircraft to airports that are actually sizable enough to accommodate very large jets and have a lot of safety limitations that are always met, whereas in Europe that's not always the case, and pilots put their lives on the line every day and work quite harder for their money. And that concludes my project. And any questions? Yes?
I have a lot of questions.
Okay. Take them one at a time.
I want other people to ask questions too. So, at the very beginning, you said that the small regional airlines are expected to deliver the same services with less seats, and all the same services that the larger airlines are supposed to provide, but with less. And it reminds me of education, but where do the cuts come from? So if the expectation is to provide the same service, where are the cuts coming from?
Well, for example, if you have American Airlines and their regional partner, American Eagle, with American Airlines with a mainline type of aircraft, you may be flying 170, 180 people and have 2 people still up in the front on the flight crew, flying all those 180 people with a large, heavy aircraft, whereas with their regional aircraft, they're flying 40, maybe 50 people, and they still have 2 pilots up there. So 1 pilot represents fewer passengers with that service, and they're all expecting to fly on American to where they want to go on a modern jet aircraft. But because these pilots going through their experience and training in colleges and other places that offer the training, they have simulators that are designed specifically for these smaller regional jets, so they're very adaptable to the real-world aircraft they will be flying on. So they do have a lot of experience, not necessarily right in the sky in these types of planes flying, and that actually doesn't count towards their number of flight hours they've been certified for, but they've been very adapted to these types of planes for many years prior, and they do represent a very good workforce who is reliable and trustworthy, but because they're at introductory pay levels, they are paid less. They may be asked to do more with less, but they are flying less people, and they don't necessarily represent the historical brand that people are expected to be delivered upon when they buy their $99 ticket or whatever that may be. So there is a distinction between one carrier and another, but the crews are very experienced and very prepared for the things they have to face. I hope that helps. Yes?
I have a question. So using your example of American and American Eagle, so you've got a brand name that people are associated with. Why, in your opinion, do you think that American would let the media kind of let the feeling persist of that the regional operators maybe they're not American, even though you're calling them American Eagle? What is your take on why hasn't American stepped up and say, hey, they're just as good as us?
Well, a few programs and news reports I have looked at, a lot of the skeptics of the regional industry have come from former CEOs and vice presidents of major airlines that may have been furloughed or just parted ways with the industry. They have, and sometimes criticized what the regional industry has been doing, how pilots may have issues with management and that type of thing, when really they're just looking to make a profit and they're setting safety aside as a second priority. But as for the people who are at management level and executive level today in airlines, they are very happy with what the regionals have been doing. And because of media reports, they kind of have their hands tied, but they don't want to come forward and respond directly to these types of reports. As great as that would be, they don't want to go out there and acknowledge that people have a legitimate fear that needs to be addressed, because that's not necessarily the full case. A lot of this is just built up to be a much larger issue than it is. But a lot of the real issue is cost. Buying a $70 million major aircraft is 3 times the size of buying a regional aircraft that may be 1/5 the cost that would deliver on the expectations of those passengers. So it has allowed airlines to expand while really themselves staying the same size and being able to deliver on expectations. And they have very high standards for these regionals. They don't just let them do what they want. They're very routinely looking into the delivery of the regional carriers and what they have been doing, and there have been numerous times where the major airline has stepped in and said, we're not satisfied with what your carrier has been doing, we want to end our agreement and part ways. Yes?
Along with that, I'm assuming there are some independent regional airlines as well, that not every.
Yes, there are a few. There's Cape Air, there's Big Sky Airlines, there's a few others in Hawaii, and a lot of them have been quite successful, but because they don't have that large mainline brand associated with their name, they may not be able to sell a lot of tickets or really expand very rapidly, and that really sets the different roles of regional airlines. A lot of these independent carriers are actually the ones with the service backed up by federal grants, like Cape Air, for example. You can fly for $59 or something like that to Rutland, Vermont, where really there's not a lot of demand for that field, and a major airline would never imagine doing such a thing. But because the government sees an advantage of flying a small plane with maybe 9 or 10 passengers into these communities, that can be a good economic engine, and that's one of the major things that independent regional airlines are able to be successful with.
Do the major airlines see any of those independents as competition and therefore don't want to, promote that too much?
Well, not necessarily, because many of the independent regional airlines, they fly routes where there's no competition and they're the only show in town, and the people to that specific market are the ones who know the airline that has that independent brand is trustworthy to fly on, rather than driving 400 or 500 miles to a major airport where you can fly that major airline and probably be paying more to do that. Yes?
You mentioned that the pilots are trained in schools. They're not tapping into the military?
A lot of the 80s and 90s, they have been looking at the military, but more recently, a lot of schools such as Embry-Riddle University in Florida, they're basically just engines which turn out as many qualified pilots as they can. So there are a lot of pilots coming out in addition to the military who are all competing for a limited number of pilot jobs for a starting position. So that's why the standards have been being raised over the past few months, because there are so few positions out there that all these newly trained young pilots are competing to work for. But definitely the military has been a large part of pilots going into the industry.
That's what I thought.
Yes.
That kind of does, my question, I don't even know how to distill it into a question, but the fact that that economics has driven the amount of hours that pilots need to acquire, rather than safety concerns, number one. And number two, I'm still not understanding why the major carriers aren't sort of taking under their wing, no pun intended, or allowing these regional people to work for them, rather than sort of trying to almost be secretive about it. Those are just two things that make me find it hard to believe that safety is first in this business.
Well, to answer the first part of your question, if you go to Walmart or BJ's or Costco, you might find something that's at an outrageously low price, maybe half or a third of the price you'd see at somewhere like Target or another major store, and that's in part because of the labor conditions in other countries that go into creating those consumer products at such a low rate. So a lot of people like to see the end result of the low price, but they don't necessarily believe in the making of that that goes into making that lower price. And it's tough, but it is the reality, and I don't really feel safety has been brushed aside. I feel it was the regulators' decision to step in. They've always said historically over the years that we do set minimum numbers, but they're not necessarily minimums. They're more expectations, or it was, what did they say? It was actually yesterday that they brought this up in a hearing with the NTSB. They set starts with an A. It was like an average or an acceptable level. That's what it was. They set an acceptable level for pilots to be trained, but they also expect the airlines to have higher standards surpassing that in order to meet the expectation for the pilots to be qualified.
Conceivably, if the demand for flying went back up, let's say the economy rebounds, everybody's, I mean, couldn't they lower those hours again, change that level?
I don't see that happening anytime soon, but you are right in that the economy can influence in some ways, but these agencies would never do something that they believe would compromise safety just because it's the economic engine. I don't see that happening anytime soon. But that was a very good point you had. And also the airlines taking the regionals under their wings. One of the main criticisms coming out of this documentary was that chief pilots and older pilots, more experienced pilots such as Sully, who landed on the Hudson, they're not going to their partners at the regionals, the captains who may be struggling, and saying, listen, this is the proper way to do things, this is what you always need to keep in mind, blah, blah, blah. And the reason that's happening is because the contract that's set up between the main lines, the major carriers and the regionals, it makes all of those duties and training and recuperating and keeping pilots on task. That's the responsibility of a regional, and that's why it's certified by the FAA as its own flag carrier with their own operating certificate. All of that becomes their responsibility. And a lot of these regional airlines operate for 3, maybe 4 or 5 different major carriers. So you might be flying one route one day, having somebody consulting you at American, and then flying another route another day and have somebody consulting you at United. So they're not always definitely just the father and son, just one and one. There is a whole different stigma of these 2 different levels, and the regionals operating on behalf of several different carriers all at once. So I hope that helps. Yes?
Do you think, these are related to Ms. Ganenza's questions. Number one, do you think that there is some idea that, oh, if there's a small regional crash and that airline is associated with our airline, it's going to sully our reputation, that there's some of that going on? And go ahead and answer that, and then I'll give you a second.
Well, some people do see that, but one thing that the media has really been vocal about in all aspects of the media is that these regional airlines are kind of operating undercover, and they're operating under a camouflage that they look like a major airline, and people don't associate the major airline with the actual crews and aircraft that these regional airlines operate. So they've actually been saying the opposite thing, that these regional airlines have been tricking us and getting away with this for so long, and that the major airline isn't necessarily criticized, though they could bear some of the blame because of this. And actually, going into the 90s and the earlier part of the last decade, there have been a string of accidents at American Airlines, at that major operation, where hundreds of people have died, and this is completely unrelated to what happened in 9/11. There was a crash in 94, 95, and the late part of 2001, all attributed to pilot error, and people haven't been coming forward and saying this airline needs to do more in the name of safety. And rather, when people see a regional airline crash, they say, oh, they're pulling this off, being able to pull a bait and switch with the consumer, and that's something people really are skeptical about.
And the second part goes back to the hours, what Molly was saying about 800 versus 250. That's federal regulation. They just regulated
That's right.
federally, right? Well, I just saw an interesting correlation between the Colgan Airlines crash and what you had said was that that pilot had just those 800 hours, and they're saying that 800 hours is the amount that they need to be able to fly safely. It seems to me that maybe they need to up that.
Yeah, and in addition to that, through my further research, I've seen that this specific pilot was actually flying for the same airline, but flying a different aircraft for a different major airline. So he was making this sudden adaptation onto a new aircraft he wasn't fully familiar with, and people criticize the airline for doing that, is making the pilot, who is relatively inexperienced, make a sudden switch into a setting, a work environment that's unfamiliar for them. But the 800 hours, I do think, is a very good standard. But this specific pilot had failed several what are called check rides, which are basically examinations where you fly with somebody in the jump seat inspecting what you do and evaluating you, and he had gotten unsatisfactory reports in several regards on that. So I do think this specific pilot was not the best qualified and may have been a loose cannon, and people could have done more to make sure he wasn't flying, but I don't think he represents in large part the types of pilots coming into the industry today.
Who should have been responsible for doing more?
What's that?
Who do you think should have been responsible for doing more to make sure that he wasn't?
I do think part of that is the management of the airline itself. They could have done more to step in and said, listen, we can't have you working with us anymore. But also with the timing of this, the specific airline, Colgan Air, had almost doubled in size over the previous year. They had had a contract with United and U.S. Airways, but more recently gotten this new contract with Continental. So they were suddenly flying out of Houston and Cleveland and Newark when they were really isolated to the East Coast. So they were expanding very rapidly and had to have enough pilots in the workforce in order to fulfill those needs. So it was a lot of it was an issue of timing. Airlines don't usually expand this quickly. Next.
Can you speak about what you did at Hanscom in the summer of 2009?
Sure.
Like specifics and how that played into this.
Well, because I'm going into an air traffic control major in college, I wanted to have some experience working in an air traffic control tower day to day and seeing the operations of a control tower and seeing the expectations of an FAA employee when it comes to the workforce and what they do day to day. So that was very helpful for me, but the way stigma it's connected to this project is that the FAA has no higher priority than safety. That's their sole operation is to ensure the industry is all that it can be, and they have a safety culture, as it's called, to ensure that when there are any lapses in safety, reports come out. They do their own reporting of errors that may have happened that could have contributed to an accident but didn't necessarily at the time. But whether it be a loss of separation, an equipment failure at the tower, they're able to report that and send it through into a database which compiles the information and finds trends and things that may be lapsing in safety so that they can avoid a tragedy before it happens. So that was called an ADSAP program. It's called the Air Traffic Safety Action Program, and that was something brand new that emerged just as I was going there into that tower, and they had all these lectures that they let us in on, and were able to evaluate the new procedures that they had for anonymously reporting things that may not be right, and being able to have that safety culture of always looking out for things that go wrong, and even if it doesn't result in any loss of life or loss in money, they're able to report that and help the people in Washington develop new procedures and evaluate what needs to change in the years going ahead. So that very closely resembles what happens in airlines too. They have basically the same type of thing that pilots do. Yes.
Last question. I found the clip very interesting in the end. Do you, the European, I know this is a little off your topic because you're focusing on American Airlines. However, do you think it behooves you as a future air traffic controller to know other languages?
It may in some sense, but working for the Federal Aviation Administration, working in places like Guam or Puerto Rico would be the only places that I would be required to know a language. But for this country domestically, the only language that's accepted is English. But if I were to work for a private entity which runs control operations in other countries, that would be something they may look for. And especially natives coming out of those countries which know the local language very well are the first people who are turned to do those things. But also, having said that, with these private companies that operate air traffic control in other countries, they don't have the same type of training across the board that they do have here in this country. So air traffic control is a little more dangerous, in my opinion, in other parts of the world where you have these airports that don't have a lot of safety systems in place and regulation that is adequate to maintain that airlines can get in and out of an airport comfortably without putting their lives on the line in the sense that you saw there. So that coupled with the air traffic control that's very spotty at all these very small private businesses, it is a little dangerous, and also taking the language barrier into account, some people may have trouble, and that could lead to bad things happening.
Thanks so much, Greg.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.